welcome on the show, Finn.
Thank
really
you so much
pleasure
for
to
having
have you. It's awesome. Thank you for agreeing to meet. So yeah, carry on with the story. So you were in Otago, New Zealand?
Yes.
So yeah, a lot of the audience is from New Zealand.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I'm from New Zealand.
Yeah.
Running it for a couple of years now. So.
Yeah, I'm delighted to be here, and yeah, we were just saying that New Zealand has a very special place in my heart because the time that I spent there was really some of the happiest time I've ever had. Like there's something about the quality of, so it was mostly around Otago and Dunedin and kind of parts south, and there was something about the particular quality of the natural world there. I wish I could give words to it, but instead all I can think of are these specific nouns, you know, like the tui and the bellbirds and very, very specific things that were really magical to me. And being able to kind of feel is that being able to be on the ocean, on the edge of the ocean and feel yourself kind of at the edge of land and sea. I'm from California, and so that experience means a lot to me. And there's something very specific and very special and very powerful about New Zealand.
No, it's awesome. We took a family trip to Queenstown. It was like, honestly, it's so like natural.
Yeah.
So serene. It's like even like from a movie when you go through these woods and it's all very untouched. Yeah. And it feels like very calm, very relaxed. Yeah. More of like a place where you could just think and solitude and like start reflecting. Yeah, that's absolutely. Nice. Yeah. So you wrote Digital Cash.
Yes.
So I was reading into it. It sounded very fascinating, and like, you uncovered the historical components of, basically Bitcoin and blockchain and all this stuff, which are very like keywords and buzzwords right now, especially, people who want to start businesses, they throw these words around. And I had a friend, it was a while back, he was talking, maybe 2 years back, he was talking about how he's going to do a startup, make some blockchain currency, and somehow do a, initial cash offering, and somehow make $1 million, which sounded very, very fast, very, I was like, okay. He's like, yeah, I've got friends that believe in it. So I was like, but what's your thoughts on this? So, give us some context behind this.
Well, the larger context is, so the larger context of the book is a way of trying to understand. So in a funny way, the book is a little bit of a bait and switch, because it really ends with Bitcoin, and in many ways is actually the prehistory of all of these technologies that lead up to it. And the reason why I emphasize that is that I think a lot of the weirder elements of Bitcoin and blockchain make more sense when we understand them as the result of a series of different political projects, utopian visions, and technical experiments that came out of very specific attempts to change the world, to like remake society through the mechanism of money, to meet a series of kind of different like fantasies and visions and hopes for what the world could be. So the reason why I say all of that is that it's very funny and amazing for me to see how it has now become this like sort of get rich quick hustle, basically, that like throw together an ICO and like sort of set it, come up with, as you say, like buzzwords and a couple of like amazing YouTube videos and something where you like gesture off into space while like CGI stars explode overhead, and then something coin, you know, and legitimately like get a surprising amount of traction out of that, right? Like things are still at the stage where this is still hot enough and poorly understood enough that you can get a lot out of it if you just know how to kind of present yourself well and play the game. The larger context for thinking about it, though, is to understand that this is a technology that I think we, like as a society, as technologists, as people, we're still kind of figuring out what it's for, and we're starting to move away from what its original design purpose was. And that's part of why there's, I think, so much kind of confusing friction happening in this space right now, because a system that was originally meant to be a kind of analog for precious metals ended up being kind of re-understood as being more important for its identifying component for the blockchain part, for the record-keeping system, than for the currency itself, and then turned into a battle of, is it more about the money or is it more about the ledger system that the money uses? Yeah. So now we still see a lot of confusion where people can say, oh, I'm doing a cryptocurrency. And it's like, okay, by that, do you mean you're like setting up a blockchain organization? Is it your own blockchain, or is it something where you're building off of the existing blockchain? Is it an actual currency where you're like issuing redeemable tokens? Or are you actually like issuing tokens that connect to like a resource that your currency makes available or whatever? It's just like, it's all over the map, you know? It's like I can't even think of actually, honestly, a good parallel from the history of technology for a phase when you could say what you were working on and no one would know like which of the many things you might need.
Yeah, because when in class, he's my professor as well in my class. So you were saying that, you know, blockchain, the specific technology, could be used for replacing Uber, Netflix, and various other things. I didn't really understand that part. You know, how can it replace these platforms?
So it's, you know, that part of that is kind of thinking about where the technology could go in the long term. So it makes sense that you kind of look at it now and be like, wait, really? Like this is supposed to replace that?
Yeah.
But part of what that's about is the notion, which is where a lot of the research and energy and focus and money in the cryptocurrency space is going, which is towards building systems of various kinds. The most common are called smart contracts that would be able to run on top of a blockchain. So all that a cryptocurrency actually is, all that the actual innovation of the technology, which is a big innovation, but all that it actually is something that we could call a distributed, append-only global ledger. So ledger, right? So it's just something that keeps track of things, right? You enter information into the ledger in exactly the way that you would if you were, you know, checking out props in a theater or taking deposits in a bank. Append only is the especially significant part. It means that nothing can ever be removed and nothing can ever be edited. It can only be added to. Once something is entered into a blockchain, entered into that ledger, the structure of the blockchain is designed to make it so that you can never change it. It's designed to make it so that you can never delete something. Okay. So if you think about it from the perspective of like this as a monetary system, right? The goal here would be to make it so that if you receive 10 Bitcoin in your Bitcoin wallet and your entry on the ledger, no one in the future could ever go and reassign those Bitcoins to themselves.
Yeah.
And then global, right? It should be available across the network. It should function not from a centralized place, but be much more widely accessible. And that's also the other aspect, distributed. The ledger is something that the collective who are running the system all maintain together. Everyone in the ideal blockchain system, everyone who's using the system, this doesn't work out in practice, but ideally, everyone who's using the system participates in the maintenance of the ledger. We
like
can all
mining and
okay. Through things like mining and through things like processing transactions. And obviously, again, in practice, this rarely happens, but for a bunch of different reasons that are very kind of technical and boring. But the essence of it is the idea that this is supposed to be a framework where you don't have to trust a third party to maintain the list of who owns what. Instead, the list is maintained by everyone who owns any part of anything. So you can all kind of work together. And that is the essence of what made the blockchain such an interesting development, was that it was the global distributed append-only ledger, but it was also the mechanism for adding things to that ledger and for all of the people who maintained it to agree that those things should be added and that the ledger was correct, which was to say a system for complete strangers to arrive at consensus. And that's a really interesting and strange development, right? Like a way for all of us with our separate computers as strangers who don't know each other, who do not know each other's real world identities, who do not have any kind of like institutional framework for, you know, giving us a stamp of approval. Yes, this is now correct. Could have an essentially a consensus protocol that would make it so that we could all agree after a certain amount of work had been done, that the system was correct, the system was accurate, we approved this new entry into the ledger, and all prior entries remain correct and have not been tampered with. That's a really weird, novel thing in the world for something like that to exist. And that part of it makes a lot more sense when you think about where the earliest forms of the blockchain came from, which was actually not even from money, but as my colleague Amy Whitaker has worked on, it actually begins with science. Because there's a whole problem in the sciences, which is how do you make sure that when someone makes a big claim and they give you all of the evidence from their laboratory, how do you make sure they haven't cooked the evidence? How do you make sure they haven't faked anything? How do you make sure they didn't, work backwards or lie? So there's this whole tradition of bench lab notebooks, which are paper books, as the name would suggest, that are numbered and where the pages are all sewn into the binding in such a way that you can't cut pages out and you can't switch the order of pages. Whatever you write down can be verified as being in the right order and so on. So you can if you're challenged, you can hand over your bench notebooks and people can go through them and verify that you conducted all these experiments, you found all these results, blah, 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 blah. So in the 1970s and 80s, engineers and scientists started to think, what would be the digital equivalent to this? And they actually developed a system, which was the first blockchain, which was designed not necessarily to secure money, but instead to just act as a kind of time-stamping ledger that could say, at such and such a time, all of us agree, all of us distributed strangers on all our different computers around the planet who are part of this network, all of us agree and can verify that this entry was added to the ledger. And that entry might literally be someone saying I shot an X-ray through this crystal in my lab and I saw the following things. And then everyone can now collectively agree that that is proven irrefutably to have been entered by that person at such and such a time. And we all now can agree on that and can verify that forever. So this is a long way around, but the way that we get to things like Uber and Netflix, they're replacing them, is that now that you imagine a ledger like that, you can imagine that ledger being able to carry some kind of small program that could essentially act as a smart contract. And so if the ledger works as I've described, then you and someone else could enter into a contract together. And that contract would then be time-stamped on the ledger for everyone to see, verified as that you, as confirmed by your private key, as we talked about today, by a cryptographic proof of your identity, you and someone else joined in this agreement together at this time and place with the following, parameters to it. And then it's there, it's verifiable, everyone can kind of confirm for themselves that this is accurate. And so imagine, just to take a toy example, that you could use this to make a bet. You could say if by such and such a time, the Golden State Warriors basketball team has successfully won this by this many points, then I will pay this person the following amount of money. And so there you have a bet, it's entered in the ledger, it's confirmed, you and the other person both know that this is now publicly time-stamped and entered into. But then, stick with the bet idea, the system itself provides no guarantee that you will pay off on this bet. So instead, you write a basic contract in one or another kind of programming language or script in the blockchain that actually holds some money from you, and we usually think of cryptocurrency tokens for this, but you really could, if there's a way that you could connect it to, a cash card that just has some money on it. It says, if by such and such a date, the system will automatically Google the scores from last night's basketball game. If the Golden State Warriors get more than this number of points, the system will automatically credit this money to this person I made the bet with. And if they didn't, then they'll credit this money to me or whatever. So you can start to imagine, okay, you've got a little program that's a smart contract. So then, and this was the big sort of longer term vision for these kinds of technologies. And then imagine building something more complex that can run with a blockchain system like that as its basis, where instead of needing to have the whole overhead of a company like Uber, you can be a car driver who can actually say, I will set up a kind of contract that every rider can enter into. Imagine this whole process gets very automated and there's a nice interface for it and everything. And I can set up a contract such that someone can send me a request to get from one place to another, and I will provide that. And in return, the system will hold some money in escrow. And once they have delivered them to their destination, the system will release the money to me. And this will get kind of much too complicated maybe to talk about here. But if you keep scaling that kind of model up, you can envision systems, people have described them with names like distributed autonomous organizations, where you can imagine someone actually writing a kind of company where if people can prove to the smart contract on the blockchain that they provided such and such a thing at such and such a time, then the system will automatically pay them out from itself. Mm-hmm. And as people like maintain the blockchain and mine it, it will like generate new tokens of cryptocurrency that it can pay into people, that can circulate and pay and be paid in a way perhaps somewhat like Bitcoin. And you can actually imagine, as bizarre as this might sound, building a kind of company that has no management, no CEO, no board of directors, and no employees, but nonetheless actually structurally provides a service. A company that, in a sense, has nothing but customers and contractors. Whether this would be a good system is like an open debate that we can have, especially in terms of how it might replace a lot of existing companies. If you thought it was hard to convince Uber to provide health benefits or recognize people as employees, imagine doing that with just some like weird blockchain framework. However, if you think about it from the perspective of, let's say, if we wanted to replace Dropbox, this is actually a working example that people are trying to sort of build and scale up into a proper system. Like I have a bunch of extra space on my iPad. I'm sure you might as well on yours. Lots of us have extra space on our computers. Our computers are online a lot of the time, in some cases all the time. Why can't we say, hey, I volunteer 50 gigabytes of storage, that it will be network accessible sometimes. And I volunteer that in return for something. Why can't I like rent out part of the unused memory space on my iPad? Mm-hmm. So what if we could actually set up a blockchain-based system with a kind of smart contract structure running on it, in which you could prove to the system, and it would be easy to do, that you were like making some part of your computer memory available to the system. And then the system can allocate that memory to people who want to like store their stuff in the cloud, right? And then, you know, we could get into the technical details about how you might like arrange something so the system knows to like make lots of little duplicate copies of things that people want to store across lots of different machines because they're less reliable than like big formal cloud storage systems. But nonetheless, a situation where then people who want to store their stuff in the cloud, probably paying a lot less than it costs to store it in, you know, a player like Dropbox, can upload things. The system distributes those things into memories that are listed in the blockchain that have some room. And then in return, the people who want to store stuff pay into the system and the system pays you.
It's very complicated.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. There's a certain stage, I realize as I'm talking about this, a certain stage with all of these where I start to feel like I am trying to talk my way through like a grandfather clock, you know? Yeah. It's like just gears and gears and gears and
yeah,
pulleys.
I get that. I get it's very complicated and very technical.
Yeah.
The thing I'm trying to like figure out is, you know, we have these corporate institutions, you know, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, these big banks. And what this is, you know, blockchain is proposing is in essence getting rid of these institutions. So my question is how would these banks allow that? You know, having power, money, and influence, how does one change their whole business model?
Yes, it's a good question. And I think the answer is in part that, I mean, and this is so I have a reputation in the cryptocurrency community as someone who's actually a lot dubious about a lot of the big claims that are made. So I'll give you kind of the bearish position, as it were.
Yeah.
But maybe the best way to approach this is to say that so there was a landmark paper that was written in the 20s or 30s, I can't remember, by this writer named Coase, this management theorist and economist, that was about that it was called The Nature of the Firm. And the question that the paper posed was, businesses are notoriously inefficient, right? Like a business as such, a firm, a company, is like a very inefficient way to go about things. There's a lot of, we all have had these headaches, right? Of like working inside a big institution. So Coase said, why do people join firms? Why do firms appear in an economy? Like, why doesn't everyone just like contract their skills together to make something happen? Like, why don't we, assemble like the Avengers when like a project needs to happen or a product needs to be realized, and all like do our separate part and then take our separate share and go our separate way? And Coase said, because the problem that firms overcome is what he called transaction costs, right? So the fact that like it actually takes time and energy for me to find other people that I can like share my skills with, where we have compatible things that we could work on. It takes time and energy to identify what we should work on. It takes time and energy to make sure that everybody's pointed in the same direction. So when we talk about technologies like open source software, part of what we're talking about is technical solutions for some of those transaction problems, right? Where, because we're all just working on a piece of software together, you can show up and be like, hey, I have expertise in this one area. I'm going to pitch in over here. And then the technology works as a way of reconciling that. So the reason I say this is that a lot of the way that we can think about the power of corporations in the 20th century, if we set aside their ability to seize and maintain political power and so on, is their ability to lower transaction costs for their members, right? To make it so that like, if you join a corporation, you have to put up with being in a corporation. But the upside is that you are working with a big team. Someone else is in charge of keeping that team together. Someone else is in charge of hiring and firing people for that team. Someone else is in charge of having the vision and the product and the master plan and so on. So when we talk about the idea of replacing things with blockchain systems, part of what we miss, I think, is we end up talking about those companies, those systems, as though they provide only one thing, and as though that thing could be very straightforwardly replaced with a blockchain mechanism. So when I am going through all those crazy gears and convolutions and structures that would go into something like this, Uber is a terrible company. In a lot of ways.
Why would you say that?
Because they're predatory and awfully mismanaged, and they lose money hand over fist. You couldn't pitchfork money into a boiler faster than they are burning it up. And the reason why, though, that I want to talk about Uber is that they are still doing an amazing job of lowering a set of transaction costs.
Yeah.
Right? Like, part of their whole pitch was we can, part of what they are in theory providing, and which then everyone else figured out they could provide too, is various mechanisms whereby you could dramatically lower the friction and cost of either making money driving other people around in a car, or getting people to drive you around in a car when you need to. When we talk about what it is that a company like Uber does, part of what we're talking about is that is the fact that there's actually a lot of work that goes into trying to keep those transaction costs low. Some of that work is design work. Some of that work is just the upkeep of like making the app run on every brand of phone everywhere. There's a lot of different kind of layers that go into it. And even if Uber is predatory and wildly overvalued, the fact remains that a big part of the service they provide isn't just coordinating drivers and rides. It's finding ways to make that process very, very, very easy. Mm-hmm. That's in many ways much more of a challenge than implementing some kind of blockchain smart contract system for being able to like put your car on the blockchain and like rent it out to other people somehow. So when we then talk about like the big institutions, you mentioned like the major like investment banks. We often talk about them as though what they do is like, we could talk even before that, before we even talk about private institutions, about public-private institutions like central banks, mm-hmm. right? Which we often talk about as though they have only one job, which is to issue money, which is sort of their one job. But a bigger part of their job is to manage an overall picture of the state of the economy such that it can be kind of adjusted through the functional choices that they make.
Yeah.
And the blockchain doesn't necessarily provide a mechanism to do that as such, right? Like you really have to like think in a lot more depth about what it is that you want your technology to do if you want it to replace an institution of the complexity of something like a central bank apparatus, right? That is like trying to keep this kind of overall human topside on like where the economy is headed and figure out how to try to tune and tweak different parts of it in different ways, depending on what goals you want to achieve. Yeah. So when we talk about something like JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs, right, we're talking about banks that manage investments, but they also do so much more than that, right? Like they position wealth and they sort of figure out all of these like tax advantage schemes in various ways. The actual process of managing and investing wealth at that scale and coming up with new vehicles to manage it and so on. Again, as strong as my negative feelings are about like the investment bank like structure, it's still extremely complex and skilled work that they do, and it's kind of not enough to say, well, we have a technology that can let you track all of your assets in this irrefutable public way. So surely that can somehow, there's just a lot of stages that are kind of like, magic hand-waving stages where like a miracle occurs and then you somehow replace this extremely complex, like socially embedded machine with this machine that you can like run off of, one powerful computer.
So you think it's a very, very far-fetched idea of, replacing it? Because the reason why I bring this up is when I was interested in the whole idea of blockchain, Bitcoin, it was a couple of years ago when it was really high, Bitcoin was like selling for extraordinary amounts. And I watched this documentary and it talked about, Satoshi Nakamoto, the sort of so-called founder of Bitcoin and blockchain. And they were talking about, they wanted to replace these institutions, especially after the 2008 financial crisis. Yeah. Because third parties were liable, even though the courts may not have agreed, but they were liable for a lot of the destruction in the financial markets. Yeah. And so they just had this idea of ultimately, Bitcoin would be the next cash. Yeah. But then I was thinking about, I was like, yes, it would work maybe in developed countries, but what about in underdeveloped countries? Yeah. What happens then when India or Pakistan or, some parts of Africa, how would this sort of digital currency operate there, and could it ever reach a stage where it will operate there?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I think it also, I think the answer to it in some ways also addresses, I think in some ways the flaw that the mistake that we make when we talk about technologies as though they have to completely kill and replace old institutions. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I say that is that digital currencies are already thriving outside of the rich world. They're just not complicated cryptocurrency schemes, right? Like mobile to mobile payment is huge in Kenya, right? Mm-hmm, it's huge in I don't know kind of case by case and country by country, but many parts of the world, in many ways, the rich world, in the sense of the world that basically accumulated assets through the colonial period and has been kind of coasting on that ever since and industrialized very early on, in many ways is lagging far behind the rest of the world in adopting digital payment platforms. Mm-hmm. The thing that makes the thing that I think is that this kind of helps us understand about something like Bitcoin is that the future of, I'll make a big claim, the future of technology in general is many and not few, right? Technologies almost, it's shocking to realize this, technologies almost never go away. It's very, very, very rare. We talk about things being obsolete, but it's very rare that they go away. Instead, they find specialized niches of all different kinds, right? They find environments, communities, circumstances where they can continue to thrive. And you can approach this from a lot of different angles, but when you take a slightly longer view than recent history, there were, I would hazard, there were probably more horses used in the Second World War than had been used in any previous war. just in terms of sheer quantitative numbers. There were horses all over the Eastern Front, right? There were horses in enormous numbers because there were all these situations where either you couldn't power things with gas or gas-powered things couldn't go anywhere, right? Like the American presence in Afghanistan is a combination of like GPS-targeted drone warfare and mobile phone network analysis and horses. You know, horses and pack animals are huge. Like they're huge and they're hugely important, right? Like a big part of certain kinds of deployment training to parts of Afghanistan now is like training in how to use and care for pack animals. And I say that to capture the sense that like the technologies around us will change and metamorphose, and we have lived through a really extraordinary set of revolutions in the last 40 years, and especially in the last 10, more or less. But the fact remains that like it's not just that we still use cash, we still use gold. We still use gold and precious metals.
That's really surprising.
Yes, yeah.
You know, when the financial crash crashed, everyone wanted to buy gold.
Yeah.
I was surprised. I was like, what? Like,
you know, and being in this part of the world too, one of the things that I really love about it is that like, I'm sure you've seen the contests, right? Where like part of what you can win is gold, you know? And like, and we still have like a whole variety of different transaction mechanisms that can range from cash and coin to personal checks to various kinds of precious metals to all the different systems of like IOUs and kinship relationships and promises and connections and all the rest of it that we can recognize over thousands of years of human activity, right? Like there's very little that ever definitively goes away. Even something as seemingly obscure as like a fax machine, you know, faxing is still a big deal in Japan. You know? Yeah, it's still a major communications tool. Like there's a number of different venues where faxes remain very important. Like and I say this not just to kind of make that particular case, but to say that I think it's in some ways the propaganda of the tech industry now to talk about this kind of mode of absolute transformation, right?
The whole disruption.
Yes,
The whole, change the whole industry thing.
Yeah, exactly. And not just change the industry, but like this is why like there's a number of, I think, really kind of brilliant social network experiments, little projects, companies, right? You know, like actual businesses with working apps that really just went to pieces. And part of what I blame, I think you can see this case by case with their business trajectories, what went wrong was that they were presented by the media, and then at a certain point they decided to present themselves as the Facebook killer, right? That they would like, Ello did this, and like whatever the hell Peach was tried to do this, and poor brilliant Diaspora tried to do a version of this, like where they started out being about whatever they were about, and then for whatever reason there was a moment where someone was like, oh, it's a good story if we say that this is the thing that's going to kill Facebook. Can this thing take on Facebook?
So it's like a PR movement.
Yes, yeah. And that sets up the worst kind of expectation, right? Like it frames the idea that like, well, either this like tiny upstart group has to, basically take over a company that more or less like has something on the order of 2 billion people. I've lost track, but like some substantial chunk of the entire human population, using it in many different ways, right? And like this company that also owns Instagram, this company that also is like moving into VR in all these various ways and so on. Like that's an impossible goal. And part of the problem is that we think of the idea of technology as being this all or nothing proposition, instead of the fact that we actually use lots of different social networks, right? Like we get used to we don't necessarily think of them as being in competition with each other. Instead, they all coexist and they all serve different functions. Yeah. And in the same way, the history of human money is the history of lots of different kinds of monies all coexisting alongside each other. Right? Like if we look back at, you can kind of pick your period of history. I'm very partial to like, late medieval or like, let's take like the 16th century in Europe, right? Where you would have various forms of coinage. You would have various objects that were not money as such, but were actually systems that people could use to co-own things. So you would have like tally sticks where you would have like these special marks on the sticks, and then you would split them up and each person would have half so that no one could make a change to theirs without the other person being able to prove, And then those tally sticks could do things like coordinate co-ownership of a bunch of cows. So like there's these amazing rings of tally sticks from like the Swiss Alps where all these Swiss farmers would like co-own the rights to different cows and to different things that different cows could provide, like milk. Mm-hmm. So we had mechanisms like that. We had we had various kinds of letters of credit. We had bills of exchange where if you were a merchant and you had a big deal coming in, you could basically turn that into something that you could sell to someone else before the deal happened. And then that person could like discount it and sell it to someone else in turn. And you could kind of all move a bunch of value around against a future event in a very, like these are very sophisticated wealth vehicles, and they all existed alongside, pouches of coins of various kinds from various denominations from various countries.
Yeah.
So all of this could just kind of work alongside itself. People had access to different classes of money, and that could be problematic in ways that we could talk about. But I think that's what the future will look like, because that's what most of human history looked like in various ways, right? People would have certain kinds of access to debt, certain kinds of access to various forms of money. Like the future is a future where we don't have to say but can Bitcoin replace JP Morgan? Instead, we can say what is it that a cryptocurrency can uniquely provide as a technology? Yeah. What is it that it can contribute, that it can make available, that didn't exist, that these other things provided, right? Because there's a lot of stuff that a digital currency probably will never be able to do as well as cash. There's a lot of stuff that a digital currency can do that might never be able to be done as efficiently as an index fund. There's many, many different kinds of things. So why can't we just say okay, let's let this technology find out what it's uniquely good for, and then focus on that, right? So maybe it'll turn out, and in fact, I think this is a big potential growth area for cryptocurrencies, that one of the things that they're really well suited to is remittance payments. Okay. Right? Yes, you're a shockingly large portion of the world's population works out of their home country, right? They work overseas and then they send money home. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the mechanisms that exist for them to send money home rip them off.
It's very hard.
Yeah.
And it's the government has become more stricter in what you can send, how you can send it.
Yeah.
It's very complex. What you said was very interesting, how the whole expectation, because Bitcoin was thrown around and marketed as something that would replace the old financial institution.
Yeah.
In my mind, when I was thinking about it, I was I don't know. It's pretty bullshit, It's been around for so long. And then that expectation, when I actually saw it, it didn't really meet it.
Yeah.
And I guess it was the hype cycle.
Yeah, totally.
It went right down. And it was really interesting how, it won't replace it. It's not binary, one or the other.
Yeah.
But it'll sort of work together.
Yeah.
So in terms of, let's say, in the next 10, 15 or 20 years, you think we're going to mesh a lot of these technologies together rather than having one form or the other?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think one of the most reliable guesses that you can make about technology is that it's not going I'm trying to find the right way. As a historian, I always get so jittery when I need to make a big declarative statement about the future, because if there's one thing that I know for sure from the study of history, it's that most of the really important things that happened because of wild contingencies and bizarre chances and misunderstandings. Mm-hmm. And most of the time people hugely misconstrued what was happening to them and where the future was headed. So that's why I'm always kind of dubious about it. But I feel like there's a couple of safe guesses that you can make. One is that technologies almost always end up being piecemeal rather than total, right? The great lie of science fiction cinema of a particular era is the lie that I think because they lacked imagination, the people who are making it, the lie that the future is all one thing. you know, like all the buildings look the same. Everybody's wearing jumpsuits, you know, like everyone is kind of thinking about the same issues. You know, part of why I really appreciate well-made science fiction cinema is that it showcases a world with a lot of different layers to it that are like aging and working at different speeds and in different ways, and all kind of like coexisting alongside each other. And that's what the future is going to be like. It's not going to be something where there's like the one total interface for everything, you know? Yeah. It's going to be, even the aspects of it that look like that are like our smartphones, right? Where, like we were talking about in class today, right? Like most smartphones look like each other, but that's not the case with a lot of smartphones outside of the rich world. And it's also, of course, the moment that you fire them up, it becomes obvious that there's a huge, diverse, super weird ecosystem of things that are happening inside them and things that are happening on them. So when we look at the next 20 years of technology, I think we should think of ourselves as, in a way, passing through a kind of choke point, right? Like we went through a really unusual event in the history of technology, which was a mass industrial and standards consolidation. We went through this kind of weird period where we had like 30 years of a global internet and a small handful of extraordinarily powerful companies. Which
almost
really
monopolies.
Oh yeah,
when
absolutely.
you're talking about Google today,
they
have a search engine. They have personalized products, productivity products. They have everything that you could need.
A mobile phone operating system.
And then they're like, shit, like they have everything. And there's anti-competition, processes in America, and how do they fall into place and do that?
It's really, well, and this is like a lot of what these companies are all now trying to find various ways to work around, is they're trying to find ways to not have it be clear how much of someone's life they control and are responsible for. But with that said, like it's not to say that any of those companies are necessarily going anywhere, but rather that I think if we want to look 20 years out, we're going to see not one internet, but a bunch of internets.
By internet, what do you mean by internet?
I mean, like there will be, we already have so think about the difference between the internet outside of China versus the internet inside of China. It's like, it's a different beast, and it runs on a fundamentally different set of ideas and technologies in a lot of ways. And Russia, like just a matter of days ago, basically tested out their own, So I think we're going to see the networks splinter into lots of different kinds of networks. And those will not just include national networks, but also new forms of communication that might run on the old infrastructure, but will be like alongside or outside the internet as we know it. So like a good sort of real case version of that right now is something like Tor, which we haven't talked about in class yet. We will soon, but is basically a wholly encrypted and untraceable network that runs on top of the internet's infrastructure. So the idea is if you launch Tor, you are actually sending messages through other people's computers in ways that disguise where those messages came from so that you can communicate untraceably through the network. And it sort of exists in its own system, even though it is in a sense like inside the structure of the internet. We're going to see more and more mesh networks, like we talked about the one in New York City. There's mesh networks in Spain. There's mesh networks in Greece. There's mesh networks just about everywhere on Earth. And those are going to kind of proliferate into their own sorts of systems as well. And that's just one example. I think we will see this kind of flowering of many different forms of these technologies, many of which will coexist alongside each other. We'll get used to the idea that we are... we will get used to the idea that we are actually like no longer looking at a particular technology and saying, okay, is this going to eat everything else?
So all these fall into place of, these countries trying to create their own internet. They're trying to have a hold of people's data. What they can, communicate, what they cannot, and privacy. Which is, something you've written about in your past book. So how does that, why should, a normal person that's going about normal job, why should we care about our privacy, or if these big governments or big companies are accessing our data? Because yes, if you're a position of power, if you're a position of influence, you have certain trade secrets, things that you don't want the mass public to know.
Mm-hmm.
But, when, the news talks about privacy, data, data stolen, it's sort of something like, for me, it's like so distant.
Yeah.
It just doesn't affect me, and I'm like, I brush it off.
Yeah.
But why do you think we should care, or should we care at all?
Oh, yes, we should. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I believe that very seriously. And for a bunch of different reasons. And I think one of the so there's a couple of different aspects of this that are worth considering for how we think about privacy. The first is that it's not just, right, so we tend to talk about privacy, just as you say, like in a kind of distant, abstract way, as a sort of general good in the world. And that, that's a pretty thin argument, right? Like, and I think one of the ways to make that more concrete is first to think about the fact that what we're talking about when we talk about privacy has changed. And this is actually very much a technology story, because when we talk about the idea of being private, I think we're still using concepts in our minds to think about what we mean by that are outdated. And that outdatedness is where the danger really starts. Because, maybe I can put it this way. In the United States, there's the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution, which protects citizens from unlawful searches and seizures of their, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's something like of their persons, papers, possessions, homes, and effects, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's basically like a very physical, concrete way of saying there are certain things about you which you can construe as your private things. And so when you lick the flap on an envelope and close it, then you have a reasonable expectation that what is within that envelope is private. What's out on the outside of the envelope is public. And that's fine. And then we had to renegotiate that when people got telephones, because the earlier forms of phone technology were mostly party line systems, which meant that they were not, when you picked up the phone, anyone else in your town might be using your town's connection to the phone system, so they might already be on a call, like you would just hear them. You would just hear their voice. If you placed a call, the operator would place it for you, and then he or she would often listen in on the call periodically to make sure, or even break in to tell you that you had to get off the line because they needed to use it for someone else. They wouldn't even listen in at eavesdropping. They would listen in because they wanted to see if you were still talking or if you were whatever. The phone is a public space. The phone is a space where the wires go outside your house. You have no expectation that those wires are not in the public sphere. Mm-hmm. And then we renegotiated what that meant, right? Because the meaning of the phone changed. We got used to the idea that this was actually a place that we expected to be able to speak without being overheard. It became important to us to have private conversations there. So every time we've dealt with a new technology that has kind of had to do with the ways that humans interact with each other, we've had to reconsider what we mean by private. Now, what makes all of this fundamentally different is that a phone is a different thing from a sealed letter, because you can have an expectation of privacy when you talk on the phone, but it's much easier to listen in on a phone call than it was to find a particular letter and open it, right? Mm-hmm. Wiretapping is actually a very straightforward process. So there's legal systems in place, right, in many countries to prevent that from happening too easily, but there's still a lot of easy ways to just listen in on a phone call. The technology has now set up a set of expectations that it can't meet. And furthermore, the phone call is also generating data about who's talking to who when, right? Which phone is talking to which phone, which is all innocent enough until we start looking at mobile phones and we start looking at the metadata that allows you to connect mobile phone to mobile phone, which ends up being used for things like targeted drone assassinations. Right? Because if you can do network analysis to figure out we know who this person is, we know they talk to these people at these times and these people at these times, and we figure this person is at the center of the organization, so we'll target them and kill them. And now suddenly people can be assassinated based on this sort of arrangement of data. And then we get to our actual modern condition. And here's part of what makes it truly different, is that now what is at stake in privacy is no longer what we used to think of as privacy. It is granular data about our bodies, about where we are, about what we do, about what our interests are, data which has predictive power, data which can be used to make guesses not just about us, but rather about many other people like us. And then those predictive guesses can be used to do things to try to influence our behavior, to try to get more money out of us, to try to abuse our trust, to try to target us with information that is custom designed to take advantage of our particular blind spots or cognitive biases or fetishes or obsessions or what have you. We have never had such an extraordinarily rich and detailed way of gathering information about who people are, right? There's no police state in the history of man has had the capacities which we have now created more or less by accident, right? Like we've never been in a scenario before. Forget the recording equipment itself. Look at the volume of devices and objects around us, including the objects that you and I are both carrying in our pockets, which are geolocating us to this specific room at this specific time in the same space. The reason why we should think about it in these terms is that we should think about this not in terms of how we might think about our own privacy, but as an experiment, right? Like as a vast experiment in what happens when you can collect really granular, precise data about, say, what everyone's faces look like. And then what happens when you can train a data set train a neural network on that so it gets really good at identifying faces, like so good that it can identify them on a CCTV screen from the middle of an enormous crowd so that your movements can be tracked step by step through space. Like what happens when we continue to run this experiment, and again, as is already happening, you can start to be offered incentives to use a tracker on your person that will provide health information about you so that you can get, a discount on your insurance or whatever. And then suddenly there's now like a whole new layer of extremely intimate data about your person and life that is available to various third parties. And all along, every step, it's like, well, I guess this is fine. And then in aggregate, so the thing that I feel like I'm kind of talking around in some ways is the fact that what really worries me is not our current state of privacy and how we feel about it. It's the temptation that this system places in front of evildoers when the opportunity presents itself. Right? Like an early significant application for computing technology was the process of going through all of the meticulous records in Germany to identify people to be collected together and murdered, right? Like when we think about what it means to protect privacy, when we think about this great experiment in gathering more data about us every day than has been gathered about most of everyone who's ever lived for most of history, we should think about it not just in terms of how we feel about privacy. We should think about it in terms of how that data could be weaponized against the most vulnerable, right? Which is an experiment that is being conducted not just on us in the course of our everyday lives, but on like the Uyghur people in the Xinjiang region of China, right? Yeah. Like people who I think are in a really significant way living in the future that like the rest of us are going to be.
Can you speak a little bit about that? What's going on for people just?
Basically, the Chinese government is managing its Muslim minority in the Xinjiang region through a comprehensive campaign of total. The scale of the surveillance is very hard to explain outside of actually being in Xinjiang, and then using that to build both de facto and distributed concentration camps of various kinds, right? I mean, in the somewhat older sense, right? Before, like, concentration camps were invented by the British. Before they became extermination camps, they were just ways to gather groups of undesirables together by a state. And the Uyghur people are being they're like biometric information, facial recognition, like step-by-step tracking systems, QR coding on like any object that could potentially be used as a weapon, which is then like registered and connected to a specific identity, a constant process of visual and data surveillance and management, which is I think like a way that we should a way that we should think about the fact that what happens to the most vulnerable will eventually like be able to be done to everyone. Mm-hmm. And so this is one of the reasons why I want us to think much more carefully and explicitly about how this data is accumulated and what can be done with it. Because it's one thing, because I'm with you, right? Like, I'm one of the most privileged people on planet Earth. You know, nobody cares about me. Like, I'm a middle-aged white guy who works in academia. You know, like in America, I'm like an American citizen. Like, I am the absolute epitome of someone where it's like, what have I to fear? You know. And it's the fact of like, okay, that's the thing that needs to be borne in mind, is that the question about what is done with all of this data is not what can be done to me personally, but rather what my data can be used for. What my data can be used for to, for example, make it easier to identify people who are not like me, people who are acting suspiciously, people whom, say, the racist carceral state in the US might want to capture, you know, or keep an eye on or keep track of. When we think about this data accumulating, we always want to think about how it can be basically weaponized by our worst enemies, right?
Yeah.
You know, we want to think about how it can be rendered infinitely less innocent.
Yeah. Because I was reading, your point is really accurate, because when I was reading this book about algorithms and, you know, the future of technology, it was talking about how insurance companies, you know, they can use all this data, all this things about you, and then decide whether or not to give you, you know, insurance and how much insurance. And it gets to the point of, like, you know, when you're watching the Black Mirror episodes, how like everything is tracked. You know, and now China has a whole, you know, rating system.
The whole Sesame process.
And it's really crazy. But it's like, you know, it's so like, you know, if this was a reality, it would really change the way you and I behave with each other. Or how I behave with the world or with anyone. And so we're on this sort of verge of crossing this sort of, you know, boundary of pure science fiction. You know, I'm not sure how long that will take. Based on your prediction, you think that, you know, these technologies and all these data metrics, all these companies that are trying to sell us stuff, how are we supposed to then, you know, react to it? You know, as citizens, as normal citizens, you know, how are we supposed to go about it? You know, what power do we have when, you know, governments have all this data about us? It's sort of like helplessness. Like, why care about it if you can't change it?
Well, that's, I think I absolutely get that, right? Like, when, you know, when we look at the ways that things are going and the ways that these technologies are being taken up, you know, I mean, we could talk about like, and also the ways in which they often include like some balance of positive and negative. There's often like a trade-off that's involved. No system like this ever just presents itself outright as, you know, like this is like the annihilation machine, you know, 0.1, first generation. But, you know, when we look at even something like, we just to kind of bear that future projection in mind, right? You know, to think about something like Aadhaar, for example, like the biometric ID system in India, which is, to my knowledge, like the largest single coherent, you know, like biometric ID project maybe ever, and it's happening super, super fast. And it, you know, as always, kind of begins technically as, you know, a very kind of well-meaning like way of trying to basically figure out how to do things like, you know, create consistent identities and distribute benefits to people who have a complicated relationship to fixed addresses because they're in like Kashmir, for instance. And then it slowly morphs into this like massive mega project to like have a single point of identity that can coordinate all of these other interactions with the state and access to benefits and things like that. And Aadhaar has a lot of complexities to it, but it's to say like, okay, like take that by itself, right? This kind of like, you know, identity management system. Okay, fine. And then you can just remember like, okay, this is also happening in the context of like a government that is going through some profound and terrifying convulsions around its like, you know, religiously exclusionary, like ethno-nationalist movement, and suddenly the ability to cut people off from benefits through being able to identify them becomes like a lot less, benign. I mean, not that it was benign before, but it becomes infinitely more sinister.
Yeah.
So the reason why I say that, though, is that the solution to Aadhaar, for instance, is not a technical one. It's a governmental one. It's a state one. I think one of the other things that I know I personally struggle with is a tendency not just to hopelessness, but rather a tendency to always assume that the solution must be another technical fix. That the solution is like some new cool, like project or idea. When in fact, like the ultimate solution is, in some ways, like one of the great lies of the 21st century was that systemic, endemic social problems should be solved by individual consumer behavior. That like this is all that like god awful nonsense about like how one way you can help with climate change is by shopping differently. And it's like, yeah, sure, but not in a way that's going to make a lick of difference, compared to actually being able to use the power of government, use the power of like human activity, of protest, even of revolt or revolution, to like shift the balance of power in such a way that constructive action can be taken, instead of feeling like it's on us to like change our light bulbs and that's going to, save the world. So by the same token, when we talk about privacy, one of the ways that I like to talk about privacy and data is that just to take the United States as a specific example, people used to routinely be poisoned by the food that they ate. There was like like things that were prescribed for children that were like over-the-counter remedies that were filled with bizarre addictive compounds, But as a country, at a certain point, through bold leadership of a handful of people, but also larger public unrest, we arrived at a new dispensation where there were sets of regulatory bodies that were in place. There were systems and inspections and projects, and people could go to jail. Their companies could be fined and shut down for creating impure food and drugs. And now we're all very habituated to the idea that you can just buy things off the shelf and they won't kill you. They won't be expired. They won't have botulism in them. They won't be like, half, rat meat. Like we really got that sorted out. And I think we need to start thinking about, I think we're still lagging behind understanding how important our lives online are. Like, I'm old enough to remember when we still talked about digital stuff as though it was like a different physical space, as though you would say like, oh yeah, I'm going to go online now. It's this big deal. And then you would like do stuff online, and then you would come back to the so-called real world, as though like that was in fairyland, and wasn't like in the same universe. And now we're starting to understand that our digital lives there's no sense in distinguishing between them and our physical lives, right? Like our digital lives, they can shape whether or not we can get a job. They can shape what kind of assets we get access to. They can shape our ability to get medical care. They can shape whether or not our children get taken away, right? Like our digital lives there's no meaningful sense in trying to distinguish them. And that means that we actually need to like get our goddamn act together and recognize that the way that our data is being managed and stewarded is unacceptable, is turning it into something that can be used against us, even if we set aside like state stuff, I often go back to the Holocaust because it is such a fantastic example of record keeping and census structures and data management being used to identify and kill people. But we can even just talk at the level of like price gouging, right? Or redlining, right? Like these are various terms for the way that if you know enough about someone, then you can figure out exactly how much they can afford to pay for something and how desperate they are. And then you can, use that to take advantage of them. Or you can decide, as, Facebook only took this down when it was like publicly revealed through extensive journalistic investigation. So Facebook has their super fine-grained system, right? You get an ad on Facebook, then you can make all these choices about who you want to see it. So Facebook will use its incredible store of data to like precisely identify the people you want your ad to be seen, but also the people you don't want your ad to be seen by. And so what ProPublica in the US figured out was that you could easily, and as a matter of course, make sure that all of your ads about real estate were not seen by people of color. Were only seen by like white people between the right ages with the right income brackets and so on. So you could effectively engage in redlining and segregation around something through this like fine-grained data control. Like there's so many contexts where we have not yet really thought through the implications of how our data can be used against us, can be managed, can be improperly handled. And in the same way that we as a country got it together to stop the improper production of baby food and the improper like management and hygiene and production of meat, we can also get it together to stop the improper use and management of our data and instead have it reestablished according to standards that we find collectively acceptable.
Do you think that's a likelihood? Like a realistic probability that nations, or you say America for example, will restructure their regulations around this?
I don't know. I do think it can happen. I think people are getting much more conscious of it. I think it's really worth watching the ways, like I think in a funny way, in a long-term way, one of the things that might have helped to precipitate it has been all of the like election fixing and like fake news and like ultra targeted advertising and stuff like that, like very algorithm driven things, because those I think help people start to realize that there were much larger social consequences to the ways that this was being handled than they had realized. And as much as the main players involved whose interests this goes against are unbelievably wealthy and powerful, there aren't that many of them, really. There's like the handful of companies, like in some ways, one of the other things that better data stewardship would do is remove some of the overwhelming incumbent competitive advantage that the handful of mega corporations in the digital space have right now, right? Like there's a lot of companies that like maybe have interesting innovations, new products, new ideas, new systems, but they cannot compete with Google. They cannot compete with Facebook because these companies have such an overwhelming competitive advantage, not just in terms of being unbelievably rich, tax dodging operations, but also in terms of these companies simply having so much more data to work with, right? That they can like produce particular kinds of outcomes, not for us, not for you and me, but for the advertisers that they sell us to. Like they can produce much better outcomes for that than anyone else could ever possibly hope to compete with. When you shift the ability to use data however you feel like, again, like our data, like data that we actually generated, value that we produced. If you can start to shift how that's handled, you can also begin to rebalance the playing field to some degree. Like, so it's to say that there's, I think, a really good argument from the standpoint of competition and industry, as well as a really good argument from the standpoint of politics and personal safety in this. So I think the argument can be made, and I feel like the problem is that it tends to take a long ass time for people to catch up with this kind of thing. Just thinking of the American example, we had all the issues with food, right? Food and drugs, impure food and drugs, poorly manufactured, unlabeled, dangerous. We eventually dealt with that. We also had things like, so you can make really amazing colors with arsenic. So you can use arsenic for dye, right? So we used to use it in wallpaper. And people would be like slowly being poisoned by their own houses. And we eventually dealt with that, but it took a while, right? Like we eventually dealt with smog, but took a while. We eventually dealt with like leaded gasoline, which was an absolute industrial nightmare. All of these things happened, but they just took a while. And so for me, at the risk of being dramatic, but I honest, I think that I almost see a kind of race against time, right? Which is that can we can we understand what our data is actually capable of and the kinds of value that it provides so that we can regulate it as a matter of the public good before the way that data is used to effectively end the political process as we know it, right?
But, I get that point, but what I don't understand is like you're talking about Facebook, which is their primary model is to target specific genre of people.
Yeah.
To be able to, restrict the amount of data they can collect is, putting a halt to their business model.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how this will play in the actual world of, what types of regulations. Can they use the data or can they not? Can they collect it or can they not?
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And I think there's kind of two parts to it. And like, so one part is, and this is just me speaking personally, is I don't give a fuck, like they can, like they're, if a business is a bad business that is having bad effects, then they deserve to go down in flames, like they don't get any special dispensation because they made a bunch of money, like neither did Pablo Escobar, So by the same token though, a more reasoned and grown up stance would be that that can be I think worked out in a pretty thoughtful way, and of course like Facebook will kick and scream every single step of the way because I think on some level, both because it's the nature of a company to do so, but also because on some level they may understand that they are not the world beating innovators that they thought they were. They just got lucky. They got in lucky and they got in early and they had some very like kind of smart people on the inside. And so they know that their moat might shrink a lot, their kind of defensive strategy for their company. However, you could dramatically diminish Facebook's ability to make use of to collect, to aggregate, and to make use of many classes of personal data. And I would submit two things that would come of that. One thing is that Facebook would still remain a hugely successful and powerful company because they love to raise such a huge hue and cry about data, right? But like they have like the most amazing backbench of brilliant engineers and programmers and computer scientists, right? Like there's a lot of really, really smart people who are stuck in those glass cubes on one hacker way, right? Working on stuff. They have Instagram, they have they have Oculus, as I mentioned. They have a whole lot of different projects and products and back-end things and all kinds of stuff. None of that would go away. The other thing though, which I think is even more to the point, is from a lot of people's perspective, Facebook would actually get better. Right? Like if Facebook stopped trying to do all of this like elaborate, like schemy algorithmic bullshit with like what gets in your news feed in weird ways and like the super bizarre targeted ads and all the random crap that is suddenly thrown up there, if instead, say, they had to shift part of their sort of content delivery model back to like, well, I guess people that you're close to, you'll see stuff from them, and then like services that you think are important and have explicitly subscribed to, you'll see stuff from them. And they can still do, let's say, there's no reason why, like advertising became an enormous industry, a very, very successful industry without ever having to use any of this stuff. Like advertising was always pretty data-driven, demographic-driven, but the ultimate heart of it was still the idea that you could make pretty good, smart guesses about like which audiences you were reaching with such and such a thing, and then design stuff that spoke to them, And consumer culture did fine, and we we built the whole.
So it evolved.
Yeah, exactly, and now there is, it's been a long day, so like you're getting a really emotional version of this, but it's all coming from a heartfelt place.
Yeah.
There's a huge, and in my opinion, fundamentally parasitic set of industries that have sprung up only within the last 20 or 25 years around the digital advertising space, right? Like there's like the companies that build the profiles, and then the companies that auction the profiles, and then the companies that promise you magic secret sauce that will help you like identify better profiles, and then all the companies that act as like handmaidens to and intermediaries for, and like, like the sort of, and special interactors with Facebook, the Alphabet holding group, which is Google, and so on. Like those businesses, I don't think they have much to offer. I think they exist because they have found a situation where there's a tremendous flow of cash that's coming from people who need to sell something. And what I would submit to you is that flow of cash is poorly allocated. That flow of cash is largely being wasted in a lot of ways. It's being wasted on these companies that are all kind of acting as various layers of intermediates that are all part of like the kind of advertising technology landscape, all the rest of it. I think it's an enormous waste of human talent, that people who could be developing apps that did something useful or interesting are instead like all trying to figure out how they can produce like 1/25th of a percentage point of a shift in the accuracy of delivering a particular ad to such and such a group. I think they, in a lot of ways, broke many aspects of the web because they ended up like turning advertising into the center of the process instead of maybe a supplementary income stream. And there's a whole other kind of story there, but I don't know if you run an ad blocker on your browser, but in a lot of ways, the experience of going to many sites now is just garbage. It's just like there's some tiny stream of text that you actually want to read in the middle of the popovers and the pop-unders and the things on both sides and the auto-playing video and all the rest of it. And
it's
all
full
of
ads.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It's full of ads. And think about it from the perspective not of our experience, but from the perspective of the companies. How effective are those ads?
Yeah, actually, though.
Yeah.
Because this book that I was reading that said that when they do the testing, it's not as effective as people might sell it to be.
Yeah.
That people are so trained to see these ads that they overlook it. They don't even pay attention to it.
Yeah.
So to your point, how effective is it? And, do we really need to have all these ads?
Yeah.
And it feels like you're just being sold.
Yeah.
Every single day, every moment,
yes,
you're being sold.
Yeah.
And one day I was just scrolling through my Facebook and I was like, I'm just seeing ads.
Yeah.
Like there is zero quality content.
Yeah.
Basically it's buy this, buy that, you're missing out on this or that.
Yeah.
And you're sort of like questioning, is like, is this the platform was supposed to be like?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And is this like, so you're telling me that I get to have an experience of constant irritating distraction with things that I either don't like or don't care about, and also it can be used by Nazis to dox me, Yay. Like what a great value add, know? That it can also eventually be used to train machine learning systems to be better at identifying individual citizens. Like that's great.
Yeah.
It really is like, you don't have to be a crazy anti-consumer culture zealot, which I am, but I still I want to talk around that, right?
Yeah.
To kind of see that this actually could really be a not optimal way of organizing what we think of as the online economy. It's one of those things where I feel like the argument for rethinking what privacy is and for fighting for better management and stewardship and control of our data is an argument that really cuts both ways, right? It cuts from the perspective of the individual, from the perspective of the process of again, not just trying to think about, what do I have to hide, but to instead think about what are the implications of this vast experiment we're conducting and gathering and consolidating data and then using it to train various kinds of systems on it. This experiment we've never conducted on this scale before. So it cuts from that side, but it also cuts from the business side as well. How have we ended up in a situation where if you want to sell a product, if you come up with a great design, a cool thing that you want to, why is it that you basically have only a tiny handful of companies that you can do that through? Yeah. Why do they get to be in charge of everything? And why do they always get to claim their percentage of whatever it is that you do? Why is that the landscape we ended up with?
It's an interesting sort of debate and discussion. For the future, what are you working on now? Like, what are you heading towards?
Oh man, I have a couple of projects which are still in pretty early days, right? So the Digital Cash book only came out a little while ago, and I've had a couple of different things that I've been thinking about. I'll give you. So I've. And those are all kind of cooking, but I'm not quite ready to talk about them yet. I will just throw out a kind of odd thing, which is that I've been looking back a lot at the 1920s. I'm very interested, it's easy to make that kind of rhyme between the 20s and the 20s, between then and now. But I'm really interested in how people came to terms in the aftermath of the First World War with the way that their world was being mechanized. And I think there might be an interesting rhyme there. This isn't something I'm necessarily going to write about, but it's something that I feel like there's if there's one thing that I can recommend for thinking about the future, it's actually looking at the past. It's, of course, keeping a good close eye on contemporary trends and technologies and everything, and understanding those big dynamics. But I really recommend looking at how people adapted before, and what they did and what they expected would happen, and then how things actually played out. I think that might be able to provide us with a lot of smart guesses as to what the next 20 years might hold.
Sounds very interesting. Thank you very much again, Finn.
Thank you for
having me. It was an awesome discussion.
This is such a pleasure.
Thank you very much.